At the forefront of Australia's climate policy is major investment in energy technology, which the federal government has claimed under their slogan, technology, not taxes. However, according to the Australian Institute, the research, design and development budget for energy technology has drastically fallen since 2013. In fact, its latest figure within 2019 marked a record low for Australia in the 21st century. Without taxes or a credible history of investment in energy technology, how are any countries on the world stage supposed to comprehend, understand or even trust the Australian way of tackling climate change?
I'll come back to you, Matt Kean, as a coalition government member. What's your answer to the question there?
Well, firstly, I'd say the states and territories around Australia are leading the way when it comes to reducing our emissions. And three of those governments...
That's not really the way it's supposed to be, though, is it, when we have a Commonwealth government?
Three of those governments are Liberal or coalition governments. The second thing I'd say is that no country on the planet is better placed to benefit from the transition to a low-carbon future than Australia. And we should be embracing this transition, not just because we care about the future of our planet, but also because we care about the future of our economy. I mean, a transition to a low-carbon future means jobs in Australia, investment coming into this country, and prosperity like we've never seen before. So we need to grab this opportunity with both hands because the race is on. And if we miss it, we're going to become a rust bucket country.
I think that's right, but we've also got to stop opening up new coal and gas mines. Australia is going to Glasgow, and under Liberal and Labor governments around the country, we are opening it. There's over 100 new coal and gas mines in the investment pipeline at the moment. When your house is on fire...
They're probably not all going to be open and established, but yes, there are 100. But
in New South Wales...
There's no basis that all of them will be.
But in New South Wales...
I'll come back to you, Matt, but go ahead, Adam.
I mean, Matt's doing terrific stuff on renewables in New South Wales, and we support it. But they've opened up 5 new coal mines in the last year, right? And there's the coal mines in Labor states in Queensland, in Liberal states in New South Wales. Like, we are pouring petrol on the fire. When your house is on fire, you don't pour petrol on it.
OK, well, let's hear how Matt Kean how do you justify that, Matt Kean?
Well, the reality is that every country under the Paris Agreement is responsible for its own Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And here in New South Wales, we have plans in place that will see us reduce our emissions up there with the most ambitious countries in the world. Based on our energy policies, which is the biggest renewable energy policy in the nation, we will see our emissions from New South Wales reduced between 47% and 52% by 2030. Now, that's up there with the most ambitious countries in the world. With regard to coal mines, let's not think that domestic policymakers are going to be able to do anything to save coal in this country. The reality is the future of coal is going to be determined by foreign governments and foreign companies. And right now, those foreign governments and foreign companies are moving to a clean energy future. So we need to be doing, rather than investing in the technologies of the past, investing in the opportunities of the future to make sure we set ourselves up to grab those enormous economic opportunities that are going to come with a low-carbon future for the world.
But given that you believe that, and given that the federal government there and the Prime Minister in Glasgow has not signed up to the methane pledge and has not signed up to the elimination of coal pledge, and in fact is still speaking about that being a part of the energy mix for some time to come, how frustrated are you by this? Are you feeling let down by your Commonwealth colleagues?
No, I'm not, because what we should be doing is identifying opportunities to reduce our emissions that grow our economy. That's what we've done here in New South Wales. We've formed a new brand of politics.
No, my question went to your coalition colleagues in the Commonwealth, the federal government. Sure. You must be feeling frustrated by that. It's clearly they're not decisions you'd be making.
I think the Commonwealth government should be doing a lot better, because it's not only in the nation's environmental interest to do so, it's in our economic interest to do so. Not winning the race to provide the clean energy of the future, the materials that the rest of the world is going to need to decarbonise, will come at the expense of Australian jobs and opportunities. So I'm arguing that a coalition government that always talks about not leaving the next generation with financial debt, should also leave the next generation, should not leave the next generation with environmental debt. That's what Conservatives should always be about. And that's why I'm encouraging the federal government to do better when it comes comes to tackling climate change.
Can I just say, Matt, absolutely right behind the states stepping up, and without that, where would Australia be in many ways, economically as well as in our climate policy? But the truth is, without federal leadership and a really clear market signal, even your business and economic talk about, other countries, etc., people going offshore and the punishment we may receive, whether it's a carbon border tax or being left out of green trading zones because we're not at the table, we're not committing to a methane agreement, we're not agreeing to pull back our coal, and we haven't even talked about exports. Exports, as it doesn't even get covered in the kind of COP we're talking about now, but should. And to say that whether countries just continue to buy what we put out there, it's just not good enough from a developing country point of view, and it will stand in the way of our moving on. I mean, you can't keep a foot in both camps, is my feeling. Yeah, and Australia continues to try to play this game of having one foot in fossil fuels and one
it's a drug dealer's defence. If we don't sell it to you, someone else will
do it, and it's not good enough.
Well, let me just ask some questions on those issues, particularly on exports. Greg Sheridan, how should Australia respond when developed nations put a tax on fossil fuel exports or imports to them?
That's just outrageous protectionism. But if I could just make a couple of points.
But they probably will. I mean, that's probably going to happen at some point.
It's not at all clear. First of all,
do you want to talk about what Australia's response should be if and when that happens? Because I think people here on this panel believe it's probably sooner rather than later, given the way everyone's scaling that down.
Well, let me put it in context. First of all, I think the federal government makes a tremendous mistake in not appearing on Q&A. They're losing the argument. They should be putting the argument whenever they can. I think it's incredibly dumb of them not to have.
Could you let them know that when you're next speaking to them?
Well, I'm telling them right now. Okay. This is really stupid, fellas. Secondly, I disagree with a lot of the things that have just been said in the last 5 or 10 minutes, and if we had another 5 or 10 minutes, I could provide an alternative narrative. We're going to cut our emissions by 35% by 2030. If we reconvene this program in 2030, I bet you'll find that Australia has done well. People in Australia constantly say the rest of the world is doing this. No, it's not. When they say the rest of the world, they typically leave out Asia. I tell you, quite a big part of the world is constituted by China, India, Indonesia, Thailand. I was in Indonesia once, and a green Australian reporter was trying to ask the Indonesian government would they ever put on a carbon tax. Indonesia has fuel subsidies. They pay people to burn carbon.
Yeah, but we
they don't.
We're
in
the
middle of a climate crisis. Aren't we being quiet here and allowing people to finish sentences?
That's an argument for the rest of the world to do more, not for Australia to do less.
So, look, fellas, I mean, I'm an endangered species here. By conservation rules, you should let me finish a sentence, Now, I think there is enormous dishonesty and hypocrisy in all of this stuff. There's also a question of what really benefits the planet. If you are a rich industrialised country and you abolish your aluminium industry, you can probably reduce your national emissions by 10%. The aluminium industry goes to China, which produces aluminium under much laxer environmental conditions, and the global emissions go up. So you can pat yourself on the back. That's all that Europe has done. In the 20 years of this, we've moved as a planet from 87% of our energy coming from fossil fuels to 83%. Now, if the rest of the world is doing this and only Australia is the bad guy, there's no evidence for that. And my final point is, whatever is happening, we are not the handbrake. I love Australia more than anyone, but Australia is not the centre of the world.
No, but we do need to talk about what our commitments might be, Greg.
Our failing to go from 35% in 2030 to 45% means 10% of our emissions, which is 0.1 of 1%. China's increase in coal right now, because of its current energy crisis,
China said today
has increased 1% of global emissions.
Dying to leap in. I'll go to Matt first, then I'll come to you, Blair, then I'll go to you, Adam. Go, Matt.
Greg, people like you are just apologists for our environmental destruction.
So that's a really sophisticated comment, Matt.
People like you are standing in the way
of our
environment. People like you are standing in the way of grabbing these enormous economic opportunities. And you need to get out of the way. You're on the wrong side of history here, Greg. You're on the wrong side of history here, Greg. And what I'm saying is that what we need, you talk about aluminium smelters. Well, let me tell you, the biggest aluminium smelter in New South South Wales is Tomago. They take about 12% or use about 12% of the state's electricity. And when we announced our renewable energy roadmap, they put out a statement saying this is exactly what they need to secure their long-term prosperity and sustainability in Australia. It means that they can stay open and operating, supporting thousands of jobs in the Hunter into the long term. So it's just a nonsense argument that you're making. The reality is
I didn't mention Tomago. But how am I making an ultimate argument about Tomago? I didn't mention Tomago.
Our prosperity for generations are changing the types of energy and resources that they want from Australia, and we're really well placed to provide it. And people like you should get out of the way and allow us to do it.
I want to hear from Blair.
Well, I think it's also a complete furphy to say that Asia is nothing but expansion on fossil fuels. Anything but.
Which, China, of course, I didn't say.
You just said that Asia was going to continue with coal.
I said they're not doing what you're saying. You said everybody is getting out of fossil fuel energy.
But today, China announced that it will not go back on its climate commitments, and it will not go for more coal. So anything that's being built in the short term...
It's producing 200 million tonnes more.
And it's ready to start pulling it back. With a net zero commitment by 2060, with clear, a 37-point plan that was discussed over the last 2 weeks, not with media, but with businesses. Why? Because they want to make the case that they will be at the table, they will be making the transition. And it is, I believe, China's way to geopolitically play a stronger role internationally.
I just want to ask, we'll have to move on to the next question and you'll get plenty of opportunities out of it, I promise you. But before we move on, I wanted to ask you specifically, Greg, China's absence there from the meeting today, what do you think might be going on there? I mean, it's being interpreted, of course, as, you know, as grossly arrogant than them not being there. But could it be that there's some inner turmoil going on behind the scenes and some wrestling internally in China over this issue?
It's possible, Virginia. I think there are three factors that are obvious. First is they are COVID obsessive. Xi Jinping makes Donald Trump look like, Paul Hogan as a germaphobe. I mean, he hasn't travelled anywhere for 600 days. He's isolated in Beijing. Happens to a lot of one-man dictators, but he's very scared of COVID. He doesn't move outside the country. Secondly, there does seem to be some internal toing and froing because they've had a different line publicly in the last couple of months. So they responded much less to AUKUS than most of our domestic critics and than most people were predicting. And then thirdly, I am not going to play the man or the woman on this panel, but I'd say to you, Blair, if you believe the Chinese government's promises on anything, there are 6 million Hong Kongers I'd like to introduce you to and a few million Uyghurs who could tell you about a couple of promises that Beijing hasn't delivered on.